This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Villette, by Charlotte Brontë. Chapter 19. The Cleopatra. My stay at La Terrasse was prolonged a fortnight beyond the close of the vacation. Mrs. Bretton's kind management procured me this respite, her son having one day delivered the dictum that Lucy was not yet strong enough to go back to that den of a pensionnat. She at once had an interview with the directress, and procured the indulgence, on the plea of prolonged rest and change being necessary to perfect recovery. Here, however, followed an attention I could very well have dispensed with, viz., a polite call from Madame Beck. That lady, one fine day, actually came out in a fiacre as far as the château. I suppose she had resolved within herself to see what manner of place Dr. John inhabited. Apparently, the pleasant sight and neat interior surpassed her expectations. She eulogized all she saw, pronounced the blue salon une pièce magnifique, profusely congratulated me on the acquisition of friends, tellement dignes, amiables, et respectables, turned also a neat compliment in my favour, and upon Dr. John coming in, ran up to him with the utmost buoyancy, opening at the same time such a fire of rapid language, all sparkling with felicitations and protestations about his château, Madame sa mère la digne châtelaine, also his looks, which indeed were very flourishing, and at the moment additionally embellished by the good-natured but amused smile with which he always listened to Madame's fluent and florid French. In short, Madame shone in her very best phase that day, and came in and went out quite a living Catherine wheel of compliments, delight, and affability. Half purposely, and half to ask some question about school business, I followed her to the carriage, and looked in after she was seated and the door closed. In that brief fraction of time what a change had been wrought! An instant ago, all sparkles and jests, she now sat sterner than a judge and graver than a sage. Strange little woman! I went back and teased Dr. John about Madame's devotion to him. How he laughed! What fun shone in his eyes as he recalled some of her fine speeches, and repeated them, imitating her voluble delivery. He had an acute sense of humour, and was the finest company in the world, when he could forget Miss Fanshawe. To sit in sunshine calm and sweet is said to be excellent for weak people. It gives them vital force. When little Georgette Beck was recovering from her illness, I used to take her in my arms and walk with her in the garden by the hour together, beneath a certain wall hung with grapes, which the southern sun was ripening. That sun cherished her little pale frame quite as effectually as it mellowed and swelled the clustering fruit. There are human tempers, bland, glowing, and genial, within whose influence it is as good for the poor in spirit to live as it is for the feeble in frame to bask in the glow of noon. Of the number of these choice natures were certainly both Dr. Bretton's and his mother's. They liked to communicate happiness, as some like to occasion misery. They did it instinctively, without fuss, and apparently with little consciousness. The means to give pleasure rose spontaneously in their minds. Every day while I stayed with them, some little plan was proposed which resulted in beneficial enjoyment. Fully occupied as was Dr. John's time, he still made it in his way to accompany us in each brief excursion. I can hardly tell how he managed his engagements. They were numerous, yet by dint of system he classed them in an order which left him a daily period of liberty. I often saw him hard worked, yet seldom overdriven, and never irritated, confused, or oppressed. What he did was accomplished with the ease and grace of an all-sufficing strength, with the bountiful cheerfulness of high and unbroken energies. Under his guidance I saw, in that one happy fortnight, more of Villette, its environs, and its inhabitants, than I had seen in the whole 8 months of my previous residence. He took me to places of interest in the town, of whose names I had not before so much as heard. With willingness and spirit he communicated much noteworthy information. He never seemed to think it a trouble to talk to me, and I am sure it was never a task to me to listen. It was not his way to treat subjects coldly and vaguely. He rarely generalized, and never prosed. He seemed to like nice details almost as much as I liked them myself. He seemed observant of character, and not superficially observant either. These points gave the quality of interest to his discourse, and the fact of his speaking direct from his own resources, and not borrowing or stealing from books, here a dry fact, and there a trite phrase, and elsewhere a hackneyed opinion, ensured a freshness as welcome as it was rare. Before my eyes, too, his disposition seemed to unfold another phase, to pass to a fresh day, to rise in a new and nobler dawn. His mother possessed a good development of benevolence, but he owned a better and larger. I found, on accompanying him to the Basseville, the poor and crowded quarter of the city, that his errands there were as much those of the philanthropist as the physician. I understood presently that cheerfully, habitually, and in single-minded unconsciousness of any special merit distinguishing his deeds, he was achieving, amongst a very wretched population, a world of active good. The lower orders liked him well; his poor patients in the hospital welcomed him with a sort of enthusiasm. But stop! I must not, from the faithful narrator, degenerate into a partial eulogist. Full well do I know that Dr. John was not perfect, any more than I am perfect. Human fallibility leavened him throughout. There was no hour, and scarcely a moment of the time I spent with him, that in act or speech or look he did not betray something that was not of a god. A god could not have the cruel vanity of Dr. John, nor his sometime levity. No immortal could have resembled him in his occasional temporary oblivion of all but the present, in his passing passion for that present, shown, not coarsely, by devoting it to material indulgence, but selfishly, by extracting from it whatever it could yield of nutriment to his masculine self-love. His delight was to feed that ravenous sentiment, without thought of the price of provender, or care for the cost of keeping it sleek and high-pampered. The reader is requested to note a seeming contradiction in the two views which have been given of Graham Bretton, the public and the private, the outdoor and the indoor view. In the first, the public, he is shown oblivious of self, as modest in the display of his energies as earnest in their exercise. In the second, the fireside picture, there is expressed consciousness of what he has and what he is, pleasure in homage, some recklessness in exciting, some vanity in receiving the same. Both portraits are correct. It was hardly possible to oblige Dr. John quietly and in secret. When you thought that the fabrication of some trifle dedicated to his use had been achieved unnoticed, and that, like other men, he would use it when placed ready for his use, and never ask whence it came, he amazed you by a smilingly uttered observation or two, proving that his eye had been on the work from commencement to close, that he had noted the design, traced its progress, and marked its completion. It pleased him to be thus served, and he let his pleasure beam in his eye and play about his mouth. This would all have been very well, if he had not added to such kindly and unobtrusive evidence a certain wilfulness in discharging what he called debts. When his mother worked for him, he paid her by showering about her his bright animal spirits, with even more affluence than his gay, taunting, teasing, loving wont. If Lucy Snowe were discovered to have put her hand to such work, he planned, in recompense, some pleasant recreation. I often felt amazed at his perfect knowledge of Villette, a knowledge not merely confined to its open streets, but penetrating to all its galleries, salles, and cabinets, of every door which shut in an object worth seeing, of every museum, of every hall sacred to art or science, he seemed to possess the open sesame. I never had a head for science, but an ignorant, blind, fond instinct inclined me to art. I liked to visit the picture galleries, and I dearly liked to be left there alone. In company, a wretched idiosyncrasy forbade me to see much or to feel anything. In unfamiliar company, where it was necessary to maintain a flow of talk on the subjects in presence, half an hour would knock me up, with a combined pressure of physical lassitude and entire mental incapacity. I never yet saw the well-reared child, much less the educated adult, who could not put me to shame by the sustained intelligence of its demeanour under the ordeal of a conversable, sociable visitation of pictures, historical sites or buildings, or any lions of public interest. Dr. Bretton was a cicerone after my own heart. He would take me betimes, ere the galleries were filled, leave me there for 2 or 3 hours, and call for me when his own engagements were discharged. Meantime I was happy, not always in admiring, but in examining, questioning, and forming conclusions. In the commencement of these visits, there was some misunderstanding and consequent struggle between will and power. The former faculty exacted approbation of that which it was considered orthodox to admire; The latter groaned forth its utter inability to pay the tax. It was then self-sneered at, spurred up, goaded on to refine its taste, and whet its zest. The more it was chidden, however, the more it wouldn't praise. Discovering gradually that a wonderful sense of fatigue resulted from these conscientious efforts, I began to reflect whether I might not dispense with that great labour, and concluded eventually that I might, and so sank supine into a luxury of calm before 99 out of 100 of the exhibited frames. It seemed to me that an original and good picture was just as scarce as an original and good book. Nor did I, in the end, tremble to say to myself, standing before certain chef-d'œuvres bearing great names, "These are not a whit like nature. Nature's daylight never had that colour, never was made so turbid, either by storm nor cloud, as it is laid out there, under a sky of indigo; and that indigo is not ether, and those dark weeds plastered upon it are not trees." Several very well executed and complacent-looking fat women struck me as by no means the goddesses they appeared to consider themselves. Many scores of marvellously finished little Flemish pictures, and also of sketches, excellent for fashion books displaying varied costumes in the handsomest materials, gave evidence of laudable industry whimsically applied. And yet there were fragments of truth here and there which satisfied the conscience, and gleams of light that cheered the vision. Nature's power here broke through in a mountain snowstorm, and there her glory in a sunny southern day. An expression in this portrait proved clear insight into character; a face in that historical painting, by its vivid filial likeness, startlingly reminded you that genius gave its birth. These exceptions I loved; they grew as dear as friends. One day, at a quiet early hour, I found myself nearly alone in a certain gallery, wherein one particular picture of portentous size, set up in the best light, having a cordon of protection stretched before it, and a cushioned bench duly set in front for the accommodation of worshipping connoisseurs, who, having gazed themselves off their feet, might be fain to complete the business sitting. This picture, I say, seemed to consider itself the queen of the collection. It represented a woman, considerably larger, I thought, than the life. I calculated that this lady, put into a scale of magnitude suitable for the reception of a commodity of bulk, would infallibly turn from 14 to 16 stone. She was indeed extremely well fed; very much butcher's meat, to say nothing of bread, vegetables, and liquids, must she have consumed to attain that breadth and height, that wealth of muscle, that affluence of flesh. She lay half reclined on a couch, why it would be difficult to say; broad daylight blazed around her; she appeared in hearty health, strong enough to do the work of 2 plain cooks; she could not plead a weak spine; she ought to have been standing, or at least sitting bolt upright; she had no business to lounge away the noon on a sofa; she ought likewise to have worn decent garments, a gown covering her properly, which was not the case. Out of abundance of material, 27 yards, I should say, of drapery, she managed to make inefficient raiment. Then, for the wretched untidiness surrounding her, there could be no excuse. Pots and pans, perhaps I ought to say vases and goblets, were rolled here and there on the foreground; a perfect rubbish of flowers was mixed amongst them, and an absurd and disorderly mass of curtain upholstery smothered the couch and cumbered the floor. On referring to the catalogue, I found that this notable production bore the name Cleopatra. Well, as I was sitting wondering at it, as the bench was there, I thought I might as well take advantage of the accommodation; and thinking that, while some of the details, as roses, gold cups, jewels, etc., were very prettily painted, it was on the whole an enormous piece of claptrap. The room, almost vacant when I entered, began to fill. Scarcely noticing this circumstance, as indeed it did not matter to me, I retained my seat, rather to rest myself than with a view to studying this huge, dark-complexioned gipsy queen, of whom indeed I soon tired, and betook myself for refreshment to the contemplation of some exquisite little pictures of still life: wild flowers, wild fruit, mossy wood nests, casketing eggs that looked like pearls seen through clear green sea water, all hung modestly beneath that coarse and preposterous canvas. Suddenly a light tap visited my shoulder. Starting, turning, I met a face bent to encounter mine; a frowning, almost a shocked face it was. "Que faites-vous ici?" said a voice. "Mais, monsieur, je m'amuse." Vous vous amusez? Et à quoi, s'il vous plaît? Mais d'abord, faites-moi le plaisir de vous lever. Prenez mon bras, et allons de l'autre côté. I did precisely as I was bid. Monsieur Paul Emmanuel, it was he, returned from Rome, and now a travelled man, was not likely to be less tolerant of insubordination now than before this added distinction laurelled his temples. "Permit me to conduct you to your party," said he, as we crossed the room. "I have no party." "You are not alone?" "Yes, monsieur." "Did you come here unaccompanied?" "No, monsieur. Dr. Bretton brought me here." "Dr. Bretton and madame his mother, of course?" "No, only Dr. Bretton." "And he told you to look at that picture?" "By no means. I found it out for myself." Monsieur Paul's hair was shorn close as raven down, or I think it would have bristled on his head. Beginning now to perceive his drift, I had a certain pleasure in keeping cool, and in working him up. "Astounding insular audacity!" cried the Professor. "Singulière femme que c'est anglais!" "What is the matter, monsieur?" "Matter? How dare you, a young person, sit coolly down with the self-possession of a garçon, and look at that picture?" "It is a very ugly picture, but I cannot at all see why I should not look at it." "Bon, bon! Speak no more of it. But you ought not to be here alone." "If, however, I have no society, no party, as you say, and then what does it signify whether I am alone or accompanied? Nobody meddles with me." "Taisez-vous, et asseyez-vous là, là!" setting down a chair with emphasis in a particularly dull corner, before a series of most specially dreary cards. "Mais, monsieur?" "Mais, mademoiselle, asseyez-vous et ne bougez pas, entendez-vous? Jusqu'à ce qu'on vienne vous chercher, ou que je vous donne la permission." "Quel triste coin!" cried I, "et quel laid tableau!" And laid indeed they were, being a set of 4, denominated in the catalogue La Vie d'une Femme. They were painted in a rather remarkable style, flat, dead, pale, and formal. The first represented a young woman coming out of a church door, a missal in her hand, her dress very prim, her eyes cast down, her mouth pursed up, the image of a most villainous little precocious she-hypocrite. The second, a mariée, with a long white veil, kneeling at a prideau in her chamber, holding her hands plastered together, finger to finger, showing the whites of her eyes in a most exasperating manner. The third, a jeune mère, hanging disconsolate over a clayey and puffy baby with a face like an unwholesome full moon. The fourth, a veuve, being a black woman, holding by the hand a black little girl, and the twain studiously surveying an elegant French monument, set up in a corner of some Père Lachaise. All these fouragers were grim and grey as burglars, and cold and vapid as ghosts. What women to live with! Insincere, ill-humoured, bloodless, brainless nonentities, as bad in their way as the indolent gipsy giantess the Cleopatra in hers. It was impossible to keep one's attention long confined to these masterpieces, and so by degrees I veered around and surveyed the gallery. A perfect crowd of spectators was by this time gathered round the lioness, from whose vicinage I had been banished. Nearly half this crowd were ladies, but Monsieur Paul afterwards told me they were des dames, and it was quite proper for them to contemplate what no demoiselle ought to glance at. I assured him plainly I could not agree in this doctrine, and did not see the sense of it, whereupon, with his usual absolutism, he merely requested my silence, and also, in the same breath, denounced my mingled rashness and ignorance. A more despotic little man than Monsieur Paul never filled a professor's chair. I noticed, by the way, that he looked at the picture himself quite at his ease, and for a very long while. He did not, however, neglect to glance from time to time my way, in order, I suppose, to make sure that I was obeying orders, and not breaking bounds. By and by he again accosted me. Had I not been ill, he wished to know. He understood that I had. Yes, but I was now quite well. Where had I spent the vacation? Chiefly in the Rue Fossette, partly with Madame Bretton. He had heard that I was left alone in the Rue Fossette. Was that so? Not quite alone. Mary Brock, the cretin, was with me." He shrugged his shoulders. Varied and contradictory expressions played rapidly over his countenance. Mary Brock was well known to M. Paul. He never gave a lesson in the third division, containing the least advanced pupils, that she did not occasion in him a sharp conflict between antagonistic impressions. Her personal appearance, her repulsive manners, her often unmanageable disposition, irritated his temper, and inspired him with strong antipathy, a feeling he was too apt to conceive when his taste was offended or his will thwarted. On the other hand, her misfortunes constituted a strong claim on his forbearance and compassion, such a claim as it was not in his nature to deny; hence resulted almost daily drawn battles between impatience and disgust on the one hand, pity and a sense of justice on the other, in which, to his credit be it said, it was very seldom that the former feelings prevailed. When they did, however, M. Paul showed a phase of character which had its terrors. His passions were strong, his aversions and attachments alike vivid. The force he exerted in holding both in check by no means mitigated an observer's sense of their vehemence. With such tendencies, it may well be supposed he often excited in ordinary minds fear and dislike; yet it was an error to fear him; nothing drove him so nearly frantic as the tremor of an apprehensive and distrustful spirit; nothing soothed him like confidence tempered with gentleness. To evince these sentiments, however, required a thorough comprehension of his nature, and his nature was of an order rarely comprehended. "How did you get on with Mary Brock?" he asked, after some minutes' silence. "Monsieur, I did my best, but it was terrible to be alone with her." "You have then a weak heart. You lack courage, and perhaps charity. Yours are not the qualities which might constitute a sister of mercy." He was a religious little man in his way. The self-denying and self-sacrificing part of the Catholic religion commanded the homage of his soul. "I don't know, indeed. I took as good care of her as I could, but when her aunt came to fetch her away it was a great relief." "Ah, you are an egotist. There are women who have nursed hospitals full of similar unfortunates. You could not do that." "Could monsieur do it himself?" "Women who are worthy the name ought infinitely to surpass our coarse, fallible, self-indulgent sex in the power to perform such duties. I washed her, I kept her clean, I fed her, I tried to amuse her, but she made mouths at me instead of speaking." "You think you did great things?" "No, but as great as I could do." "Then limited are your powers, for in tending one idiot you fell sick." "Not with that, monsieur. I had a nervous fever. My mind was ill." "Vraiment! Vous valez peu de chose. You are not cast in an heroic mould. Your courage will not avail to sustain you in solitude. It merely gives you the temerity to gaze with sang-froid at pictures of Cleopatra." It would have been easy to show anger at the teasing, hostile tone of the little man. I had never been angry with him yet, however, and I had no present disposition to begin. "Cleopatra," I repeated quietly. "Monsieur, too, has been looking at Cleopatra. What does he think of her?" "Cela ne vaut rien," he responded. "Une femme superbe, une taille d'impératrice, des formes d'agénant, mais une personne dont je ne voudrais ni pour femme, ni pour fille, ni pour sœur. Aussi vous ne jetterez plus un seul coup d'œil de sa côté." "But I have looked at her a great many times while monsieur has been talking. I can see her quite well from this corner." "Turn to the wall and study your 4 pictures of a woman's life." "Excuse me, Monsieur Paul, they are too hideous; but if you admire them, allow me to vacate my seat, and leave you to their contemplation." "Mademoiselle," he said, grimacing a half-smile, or what he intended for a smile, though it was but a grim and hurried manifestation, "you nurslings of Protestantism astonish me. You unguarded Englishwomen walk calmly amidst red-hot ploughshares and escape burning. I believe, if some of you were thrown into Nebuchadnezzar's hottest furnace, you would issue forth untraversed by the smell of fire. Will monsieur have the goodness to move an inch to one side?" "How? At what are you gazing now? You are not recognizing an acquaintance among that group of gens? "I think so. Yes, I see there a person I know." In fact, I had caught a glimpse of a head too pretty to belong to any other than the redoubted Colonel de Hamal. What a very finished, highly polished little pate it was! What a figure, so trim and natty! What womanish feet and hands! How daintily he held a glass to one of his optics! With what admiration he gazed upon the Cleopatra! And then how engagingly he tittered and whispered a friend at his elbow! Oh, the man of sense! The refined gentleman of superior taste and tact! I observed him for about 10 minutes, and perceived that he was exceedingly taken with this dusk and portly Venus of the Nile. So much was I interested in his bearing, so absorbed in divining his character by his looks and movements, I temporarily forgot M. Paul. In the interim, a group came between that gentleman and me, or possibly his scruples might have received another and worse shock from my present abstraction, causing him to withdraw voluntarily. At any rate, when I again looked around, he was gone. My eye, pursuant of the search, met not him, but another and dissimilar figure, well seen amidst the crowd, for the height as well as the port lent each its distinction. This way came Dr. John, in visage, shape, and hue as unlike the dark, acerb, and caustic little professor, as the fruit of the Hesperides might be unlike the sloe in the wild thicket; as the high-couraged but tractable Arabian is unlike the rude and stubborn Sheltie. He was looking for me, but had not yet explored the corner where the schoolmaster had just put me. I remained quiet; yet another minute I would watch. He approached de Hamal. He paused near him. I thought he had a pleasure in looking over his head. Dr. Bretton, too, gazed on the Cleopatra. I doubt if it were to his taste. He did not simper like the little Count. His mouth looked fastidious, his eye cool. Without demonstration he stepped aside, leaving room for others to approach. I saw now that he was waiting, and rising, I joined him. We took one turn around the gallery. With Graham it was always very pleasant to take such a turn. I liked dearly to hear what he had to say about either pictures or books, because without pretending to be a connoisseur, he always spoke his thought, and that was sure to be fresh. Very often it was also just and pithy. It was pleasant also to tell him some things he did not know. He listened so kindly, so teachably, unformalized by scruples lest so to bend his bright handsome head, to gather a woman's rather obscure and stammering explanation should imperil the dignity of his manhood. And when he communicated information in return, it was with a lucid intelligence that left all his words clear graven on the memory. No explanation of his giving, no fact of his narrating, did I ever forget. As we left the gallery, I asked him what he thought of the Cleopatra, after making him laugh by telling him how Professor Emanuel had sent me to the right about, and taking him to see the sweet series of pictures recommended to my attention. "Pooh!" said he, "my mother is a better-looking woman. I heard some French fops yonder designating her as le type du voluptueux. If so, I can only say, le voluptueux is little to my liking. Compare that mulatto with Ginevra." End of chapter 19.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Michelle Crandall in Fremont, California, May 2006. Villette by Charlotte Brontë. Chapter 20. The Concert. One morning, Mrs. Bretton, coming promptly into my room, desired me to open my drawers and show her my dresses, which I did without a word. "That will do," said she, when she had turned them over. "You must have a new one." She went out. She returned presently with a dressmaker. She had me measured. "I mean," said she, "to follow my own tastes, and to have my own way in this little matter." 2 days after came home a pink dress. "That is not for me," I said hurriedly, feeling that I would almost as soon clothe myself in the costume of a Chinese lady of rank. "We shall see whether it is for you or not," rejoined my godmother, adding with her resistless decision, "Mark my words, you will wear it this very evening." I thought I should not. I thought no human force should avail to put me into it. A pink dress! I knew it not. It knew not me. I had not proved it. My godmother went on to decree that I was to go with her and Graham to a concert that same night, which concert she explained was a grand affair to be held in the large salle, or hall, of the principal musical society. The most advanced pupils of the Conservatoire were to perform. It was to be followed by a lottery au bénéfice des pauvres, and to crown all, the King, Queen, and Prince of Labassecour were to be present. Graham, in sending tickets, had enjoined attention to costume as a compliment due to royalty. He also recommended punctual readiness by 7 o'clock. About 6 I was ushered upstairs. Without any force at all, I found myself led and influenced by another's will, unconsulted, unpersuaded, quietly overruled. In short, the pink dress went on, softened by some drapery of black lace. I was pronounced to be en grande tenue, and requested to look in the glass. I did so with some fear and trembling. With more fear and trembling I turned away. 7 o'clock struck. Dr. Bretton was come. My godmother and I went down. She was clad in brown velvet. As I walked in her shadow, how I envied her those folds of grave, dark majesty. Graham stood in the drawing-room doorway. "I do hope he will not think I have been decking myself out to draw attention," was my uneasy aspiration. "Here, Lucy, are some flowers," said he, giving me a bouquet. He took no further notice of my dress than was conveyed in a kind smile and satisfied nod, which calmed at once my sense of shame and fear of ridicule. For the rest, the dress was made with extreme simplicity, guiltless of flounce or furbelow. It was but the light fabric and bright tint which scared me, and since Graham found in it nothing absurd, my own eye consented soon to become reconciled. I suppose people who go every night to places of public amusement can hardly enter into the fresh gala feeling with which an opera or a concert is enjoyed by those for whom it is a rarity. I am not sure that I expected great pleasure from the concert, having but a very vague notion of its nature, but I liked the drive there well. The snug comfort of the close carriage on a cold though fine night, the pleasure of setting out with companions so cheerful and friendly, the sight of the stars glinting fitfully through the trees as we rolled along the avenue, then the freer burst of the night sky when we issued forth to the open chaussée, the passage through the city gates, the lights there burning, the guards there posted, the pretence of inspection to which we were there submitted, and which amused us so much, all these small matters had for me, in their novelty, a peculiarly exhilarating charm. How much of it lay in the atmosphere of friendship diffused about me, I know not. Dr. John and his mother were both in their finest mood, contending animatedly with each other the whole way, and as frankly kind to me as if I had been of their kin. Our way lay through some of the best streets of Villette, streets brightly lit and far more lively now than at high noon. How brilliant seemed the shops, how glad, gay, and abundant flowed the tide of life along the broad pavement! While I looked, the thought of the Rue Fossette came across me, of the walled-in garden and schoolhouse, and of the dark vast classes, where, as at this very hour, it was my wont to wander all solitary, gazing at the stars through the high blindless windows, and listening to the distant voice of the reader in the refectory, monotonously exercised upon the lecture pews. Thus must I soon again listen and wander, and this shadow of the future stole with timely sobriety across the radiant present. By this time we had got into a current of carriages all tending in one direction, and soon the front of a great illuminated building blazed before us. Of what I should see within this building, I had, as before intimated, but an imperfect idea, for no place of public entertainment had it ever been my lot to enter yet. We alighted under a portico where there was a great bustle and a great crowd, but I do not distinctly remember further details until I found myself mounting a majestic staircase, wide and easy of ascent, deeply and softly carpeted with crimson, leading up to great doors closed solemnly, and whose panels were also crimson-clothed. I hardly noticed by what magic these doors were made to roll back. Dr. John managed these points. Roll back they did, however, and within was disclosed a hall, grand, wide, and high, whose sweeping circular walls and domed hollow ceiling seemed to me all dead gold: thus with nice art was it stained, relieved by cornicing, fluting, and garlandry, either bright like gold burnished, or snow white like alabaster, or white and gold mingled in wreaths of gilded leaves and spotless lilies. Wherever drapery hung, wherever carpets were spread, or cushions placed, the sole colour employed was deep crimson. Pendant from the dome flamed a mass that dazzled me, a mass, I thought, of rock crystal, sparkling with facets, dreaming with drops, ablaze with stars, and gorgeously tinged with dews of gems dissolved or fragments of rainbows shivered. It was only the chandelier, reader, but for me it seemed the work of Eastern genii. I almost looked to see if a huge, dark, cloudy hand, that of the slave of the lamp, were not hovering in the lustrous and perfumed atmosphere of the cupola, guarding its wondrous treasure. We moved on. I was not at all conscious whither, but at some turn we suddenly encountered another party approaching from the opposite direction. I just now see that group, as it flashed upon me for one moment. A handsome middle-aged lady in dark velvet, a gentleman who might be her son, the best face, the finest figure, I thought, I had ever seen, a third person in a pink dress and black lace mantle. I noted them all, the third person as well as the other two, and for the fraction of a moment believed them all strangers, thus receiving an impartial impression of their appearance. But the impression was hardly felt and not fixed before the consciousness that I faced a great mirror filling a compartment between two pillars dispelled it. The party was our own party. Thus, for the first, and perhaps only time in my life, I enjoyed the "giftie" of seeing myself as others see me. No need to dwell on the result. It brought a jar of discord, a pang of regret. It was not flattering, yet, after all, I ought to be thankful. It might have been worse. At last we were seated in places commanding a good general view of that vast and dazzling, but warm and cheerful hall. Already it was filled, and filled with a splendid assemblage. I do not know that the women were very beautiful, but their dresses were so perfect, and foreigners, even such as are ungraceful in domestic privacy, seem to possess the art of appearing graceful in public. However blunt and boisterous those everyday and home movements connected with peignoir and papillotes, there is a slide, a bend, a carriage of the head and arms, a mine of the mouth and eyes, kept nicely in reserve for gala use, always brought out with the grande toilette, and duly put on with the parure. Some fine forms there were here and there, models of a peculiar style of beauty, a style, I think, never seen in England, a solid, firm-set sculptural style. These shapes have no angles. A caryatid in marble is almost as flexible. A Phidian goddess is not more perfect in a certain still and stately sort. They have such features as the Dutch painters give to their Madonnas. Low country classic features, regular but round, straight but solid, and for their depth of expressionless calm, of passionless peace, a polar snowfield could alone offer a type. Women of this order need no ornament, and they seldom wear any. The smooth hair, closely braided, supplies a sufficient contrast to the smoother cheek and brow. The dress cannot be too simple. The rounded arm and perfect neck require neither bracelet nor chain. With one of these beauties I once had the honour and rapture to be perfectly acquainted. The inert force of the deep-settled love she bore herself was wonderful. It could only be surpassed by her proud impotency to care for any other living thing. Of blood her cool veins conducted no flow. Placid lymph filled and almost obstructed her arteries. Such a Juno as I have described sat full in our view, a sort of mark for all eyes, and quite conscious that so she was, but proof to the magnetic influence of gaze or glance. Cold, rounded, blonde, and beauteous as the white column, capitalled with gilding, which rose at her side. Observing that Dr. John's attention was much drawn towards her, I entreated him in a low voice, for the love of heaven, to shield well his heart. "You need not fall in love with that lady," I said, "because, I tell you beforehand, you might die at her feet, and she would not love you again." "Very well," said he. "And how do you know that the spectacle of her grand insensibility might not with me be the strongest stimulus to homage? The sting of desperation is, I think, a wonderful irritant to my emotions. But," shrugging his shoulders, "you know nothing about these things. I'll address myself to my mother. Mamma, I'm in a dangerous way." "As if that interested me," said Mrs. Bretton. "Alas, the cruelty of my lot!" responded her son. "Never man had a more unsentimental mother than mine. She never seems to think that such a calamity can befall her as a daughter-in-law. If I don't, it is not for want of having that same calamity held over my head. You have threatened me with it for the last 10 years. "Mamma, I am going to be married soon," was the cry before you are well out of jackets. "But, mother, one of these days it will be realized. All of a sudden, when you think you are most secure, I shall go forth like Jacob or Esau, or any other patriarch, and take me a wife. Perhaps of these, which are of the daughters of the land. At your peril, John Graham, that is all. This mother of mine means me to be an old bachelor. What a jealous old lady it is! But now just look at that splendid creature in the pale blue satin dress, and hair of paler brown, with reflet satins as those of her robe. Would you not feel proud, mamma, if I were to bring that goddess home some day and introduce her to you as Mrs. Bretton, Jr.? You will bring no goddess to La Terrasse. That little château will not contain two mistresses, especially if the second be of the height, bulk, and circumference of that mighty doll in wood and wax, and kid and satin. Mamma, she would fill your blue chair so admirably." "Fill my chair! I defy the foreign usurper. A rueful chair should it be for her. But hush, John Graham, hold your tongue and use your eyes." During the above skirmish, the hall, which I had thought seemed full at the entrance, continued to admit party after party, until the semicircle before the stage presented one dense mass of heads, sloping from floor to ceiling. The stage, too, or rather the wide temporary platform, larger than any stage, desert half an hour since, was now overflowing with life. Round two grand pianos, placed about the centre, a white flock of young girls, the pupils of the Conservatoire, had noiselessly poured. I had noticed their gathering, while Graham and his mother were engaged in discussing the belle in blue satin, and had watched with interest the process of arraying and marshalling them. Two gentlemen, in each of whom I recognized an acquaintance, officered this virgin troop. One, an artistic-looking man, bearded and with long hair, was a noted pianiste, and also the first music teacher in Villette. He attended twice a week at Madame Beck's pensionnat, to give lessons to the very few pupils whose parents were rich enough to allow their daughters the privilege of his instructions. His name was Monsieur Joseph Emmanuel, and he was half-brother to Monsieur Paul, which potent personage was now visible in the person of the second gentleman. Monsieur Paul amused me. I smiled to myself as I watched him. He seemed so thoroughly in his element, standing conspicuous in presence of a wide and grand assemblage, arranging, restraining, overawing about 100 young ladies. He was, too, so perfectly in earnest, so energetic, so intent, and above all, so of the foreigners then resident in Villette. These took possession of the crimson benches. The ladies were seated. Most of the men remained standing. Their sable rank, lining the background, looked like a dark foil to the splendour displayed in front. Nor was this splendour without varying light and shade and gradation. The middle distance was filled with matrons in velvets and satins, in plumes and gems. The benches in the foreground, to the Queen's right hand, seemed devoted exclusively to young girls, the flower, perhaps I should rather say the bud, of Villette aristocracy. Here were no jewels, no headdresses, no velvet pile or silken sheen purity. Simplicity and aerial grace reigned in that virgin band. Young heads simply braided, and fair forms, I was going to write sylph forms, but that would have been quite untrue. Several of these jeunes filles, who had not numbered more than 16 or 17 years, boasted contours as robust and solid as those of a stout Englishwoman of 25. Fair forms, robed in white or pale rose or placid blue, suggested thoughts of heaven and angels. I knew a couple, at least, of these roses et blanches, specimens of humanity. Here was a pair of Madame Beck's late pupils, Mesdemoiselles Mathilde and Angélique, pupils who, during their last year at school, ought to have been in the first class, but whose brains never got them beyond the second division. In English they had been under my own charge, and hard work it was to get them to translate rationally a page of the Vicar of Wakefield. Also, during 3 months I had one of them for my vis-à-vis at table, and the quantity of household bread, butter, and stewed fruit she would habitually consume at second déjeuner was a real world's wonder, to be exceeded only by the fact of her actually pocketing slices she could not eat. Here be truths, wholesome truths too. I knew another of these seraphs, the prettiest, or at any rate the least demure and hypocritical looking of the lot. She was seated by the daughter of an English peer, also an honest though haughty-looking girl. Both had entered in the suite of the British Embassy. She, i.e. my acquaintance, had a slight, pliant figure, not at all like the forms of the foreign damsels. Her hair, too, was not close braided like a shell or a skull-cap of satin. It looked like hair, and waved from her head, long, curled, and flowing. She chatted away volubly, and seemed full of a light-headed sort of satisfaction with herself and her position. I did not look at Dr. Bretton, but I knew that he too saw Ginevra Fanshawe. He had become so quiet, he answered so briefly his mother's remarks, he so often suppressed a sigh. Why should he sigh? He had confessed a taste for the pursuit of love under difficulties. Here was full gratification for that taste. His lady love beamed upon him from a sphere above his own. He could not come near her. He was not certain that he could win from her a look. I watched to see if she would so far favour him. Our seat was not far from the crimson benches. We must inevitably be seen thence, by eyes so quick and roving as Miss Fanshawe's, and very soon those optics of hers were upon us, at least upon Dr. and Mrs. Bretton. I kept rather in the shade and out of sight, not wishing to be immediately recognised. She looked quite steadily at Dr. John, and then she raised a glass to examine his mother. A minute or two afterwards she laughingly whispered her neighbour. Upon the performance commencing, her rambling attention was attracted to the platform. On the concert I need not dwell. The reader would not care to have my impressions thereanent, and indeed it would not be worth while to record them, as they were the impressions of an ignorant crass. The young ladies of the Conservatoire, being very much frightened, made rather a tremulous exhibition on the two grand pianos. Monsieur Joseph Emanuel stood by them while they played, but he had not the tact or influence of his kinsman, who, under similar circumstances, would certainly have compelled pupils of his to demean themselves with heroism and self-possession. Monsieur Paul would have placed the hysteric débutantes between two fires, terror of the audience and terror of himself, and would have inspired them with the courage of desperation, by making the latter terror incomparably the greater. Monsieur Joseph could not do this. Following the white muslin pianistes came a fine, full-grown, sulky lady in white satin. She sang. Her singing just affected me like the tricks of a conjurer. I wondered how she did it, how she made her voice run up and down, and cut such marvellous capers. But a simple Scotch melody, played by a rude street minstrel, has often moved me more deeply. Afterwards stepped forth a gentleman, who, bending his body a good deal in the direction of the King and Queen, and frequently approaching his white-gloved hand to the region of his heart, vented a bitter outcry against a certain fausse Isabelle. I thought he seemed especially to solicit the Queen's sympathy, but, unless I am egregiously mistaken, Her Majesty lent her attention rather with the calm of courtesy than the earnestness of interest. This gentleman's state of mind was very harrowing, and I was glad when he wound up his musical exposition of the same. Some rousing choruses struck me as the best part of the evening's entertainment. There were present deputies from all the best provincial choral societies, genuine barrel-shaped native Labassecouriens. These worthies gave voice without mincing the matter. Their hearty exertions had at least this good result: the ear drank thence a satisfying sense of power. Through the whole performance, timid instrumental duets, conceited vocal solos, sonorous bass-lunged choruses, my attention gave but one eye and one ear to the stage, the other being permanently retained in the service of Dr. Bretton. I could not forget him, nor cease to question how he was feeling, what he was thinking, whether he was amused or the contrary. At last he spoke. "And how do you like it all, Lucy? You are very quiet," he said in his own cheerful tone. "I am quiet," I said, "because I am so very, very much interested, not merely with the music, but with everything about me." He then proceeded to make some further remarks, with so much equanimity and composure, that I began to think he had really not seen what I had seen, and I whispered, "Miss Fanshawe is here. Have you noticed her?" "Oh, yes, and I observed that you noticed her too." "Is she come with Miss Cholmondeley, do you think?" "Mrs. Cholmondeley is there with a very grand party." "Yes, Ginevra was in her train, and Mrs. Cholmondeley was in Lady 's train, who was in the Queen's train. If this were not one of the compact little minor European courts, whose very formalities are little more imposing than familiarities, and whose gala grandeur is but homeliness in Sunday array, it would all sound very fine. Ginevra saw you, I think? So do I think so. I have had my eye on her several times since you withdrew yours, and I have had the honour of witnessing a little spectacle which you were spared. I did not ask what. I waited voluntary information, which was presently given. Miss Fanshawe, he said, has a companion with her, a lady of rank. I happen to know Lady Sarah by sight. Her noble mother has called me in professionally. She is a proud girl, but not in the least insolent, and I doubt whether Ginevra will have gained ground in her estimation by making a butt of her neighbours. What neighbours? Merely myself and my mother. As to me, it is all very natural. Nothing, I suppose, can be fairer game than the young bourgeois doctor. But my mother! I never saw her ridiculed before. Do you know, the curling lip and sarcastically levelled glass thus directed gave me a most curious sensation. Think nothing of it, Dr. John. It is not worth while. If Ginevra were in a giddy mood, as she is eminently to-night, she would make no scruple of laughing at that mild, pensive queen, or that melancholy king. She is not actuated by malevolence, but sheer heedless folly. To a feather-brained squirrel-girl, nothing is sacred. But you forget. I have not been accustomed to look on Miss Fanshawe in the light of a feather-brained schoolgirl. Was she not my divinity, the angel of my career? Hem! There was your mistake. To speak the honest truth, without any false rant or assumed romance, there actually was a moment 6 months ago when I thought her divine. Do you remember our conversation about the presents? I was not quite open with you in discussing that subject. The warmth with which you took it up amused me. By way of having the full benefit of your lights, I allowed you to think me more in the dark than I really was. It was that test of the presents which first proved Ginevra mortal. Still, her beauty retained its fascination. 3 days, 3 hours ago, I was very much her slave. As she passed me to-night, triumphant in beauty, my emotions did her homage, but for one luckless sneer, I should yet be the humblest of her servants. She might have scoffed at me, and, while wounding, she would not soon have alienated me. Through myself, she could not in 10 years have done what in a moment she has done through my mother." He held his peace awhile. Never before had I seen so much fire and so little sunshine in Dr. John's blue eye as just now. "Lucy," he recommenced, "look well at my mother, and say, without fear or favour, in what light she now appears to you." "As she always does, an English middle-class gentlewoman, well, though gravely dressed, habitually independent of pretence, constitutionally composed and cheerful." "So she seems to me, bless her. The merry may laugh with mamma, but the weak only will laugh at her. She shall not be ridiculed, with my consent at least, nor without my scorn, my antipathy, my—" He stopped, and it was time, for he was getting excited, more it seemed than the occasion warranted. I did not then know that he had witnessed double cause for dissatisfaction with Miss Fanshawe. The glow of his complexion, the expansion of his nostril, the bold curve which disdain gave his well-cut under lip, showed him in a new and striking phase. Yet the rare passion of the constitutionally suave and serene is not a pleasant spectacle, nor did I like the sort of vindictive thrill which passed through his strong young frame. "Do I frighten you, Lucy?" he asked. "I cannot tell why you are so very angry." "For this reason," he muttered in my ear, "Ginevra is neither a pure angel nor a pure-minded woman." "Nonsense! You exaggerate. She has no great harm in her." "Too much for me. I can see where you are blinded. Now dismiss the subject. Let me amuse myself by teasing mamma. I will assert that she is flagging." "Mamma, pray rouse yourself." "John, I will certainly rouse you if you are not better conducted. Will you and Lucy be silent, that I may hear the singing?" They were then thundering in a chorus, under cover of which all the previous dialogue had taken place. "You hear the singing, mamma. Now I will wager my studs, which are genuine, against your paste brooch." "My paste brooch, Graham? Profane boy! You know that it is a stone of value." "Oh, that is one of your superstitions. You were cheated in the business." "I am cheated in fewer things than you imagine. How do you happen to be acquainted with young ladies of the court, John? I have observed 2 of them pay you no small attention during the last half hour." "I wish you would not observe them." "Why not? Because one of them satirically levels her eyeglass at me? She is a pretty silly girl. But are you apprehensive that her titter will discomfit the old lady?" "The sensible, admirable old lady! Mother, you are better to me than 10 wives yet." "Don't be demonstrative, John, or I shall faint, and you will have to carry me out. And if that burden were laid upon you, you would reverse your last speech and exclaim, 'Mother, 10 wives could hardly be worse to me than you are.'" The concert over, the lottery au bénéfice des pauvres came next. The interval between was one of general relaxation, and the pleasantest imaginable stir and commotion. The white flock was cleared from the platform. A busy throng of gentlemen crowded it instead, making arrangements for the drawing; and amongst these, the busiest of all, reappeared that certain well-known form, not tall but active, alive with the energy and movement of 3 tall men. How M. Paul did work! How he issued directions, and, at the same time, set his own shoulder to the wheel! Half a dozen assistants were at his beck to remove the pianos, etc. No matter, he must add to their strength his own. The redundancy of his alertness was half vexing, half ludicrous. In my mind I both disapproved and derided most of this fuss. Yet, in the midst of prejudice and annoyance, I could not, while watching, avoid perceiving a certain not disagreeable naïveté in all he did and said; nor could I be blind to certain vigorous characteristics of his physiognomy, rendered conspicuous now by the contrast with a throng of tamer faces: the deep, intent keenness of his eye, the power of his forehead, pale, broad, and full, the mobility of his most flexible mouth. He lacked the calm of force, but its movement and its fire he signally possessed. Meanwhile, the whole hall was in a stir. Most people rose and remained standing, for a change. Some walked about; all talked and laughed. The crimson compartment presented a peculiarly animated scene. The long cloud of gentlemen, breaking into fragments, mixed with the rainbow line of ladies. 2 or 3 officer-like men approached the king and conversed with him. The queen, leaving her chair, glided along the rank of young ladies, who all stood up as she passed, and to each in turn I saw her vouchsafe some token of kindness, a gracious word, look, or smile. To the 2 pretty English girls, Lady Sarah and Ginevra Fanshawe, she addressed several sentences. As she left them, both, and especially the latter, seemed to glow all over with gratification. They were afterwards accosted by several ladies, and a little circle of gentlemen gathered around them. Mongst these, the nearest to Ginevra, stood the Count d'Aumale. "This room is stiflingly hot," said Dr. Bretton, rising with sudden impatience. "Lucy, mother, will you come a moment to the fresh air?" "Go with him, Lucy," said Mrs. Bretton. "I would rather keep my seat." Willingly would I have kept mine also, but Graham's desire must take precedence of my own. I accompanied him. We found the night air keen, or at least I did. He did not seem to feel it, but it was very still, and the star-sown sky spread cloudless. I was wrapped in a fur shawl. We took some turns on the pavement. In passing under a lamp, Graham encountered my eye. "You look pensive, Lucy. Is it on my account?" "I was only fearing that you were grieved." "Not at all: so be of good cheer, as I am. Whenever I die, Lucy, my persuasion is that it will not be of a heart complaint. I may be stung, I may seem to droop for a time, but no pain or malady of sentiment has yet gone through my whole system. You have always seen me cheerful at home?" "Generally." "I am glad," she laughed at my mother. "I would not give the old lady for a dozen beauties. That sneer did me all the good in the world. Thank you, Miss Fanshawe." And he lifted his hat from his waved locks, and made a mock reverence. "Yes," said he, "I thank her. She has made me feel that 9 parts in 10 of my heart have always been sound as a bell, and the 10th bled from a mere puncture, a lancet prick that will heal in a trice." "You are angry just now, heated and indignant. You will think and feel differently to-morrow." "I, heated and indignant? You don't know me. On the contrary, the heat is gone. I am as cool as the night, which, by the way, may be too cool for you. We will go back." "Dr. John, this is a sudden change." "Not it; or if it be, there are good reasons for it. 2 good reasons. I have told you one. But now let us re-enter." We did not easily regain our seats. The lottery was begun, and all was excited confusion. Crowds blocked the sort of corridor along which we had to pass. It was necessary to pause for a time. Happening to glance round, indeed I half fancied I heard my name pronounced, I saw quite near the ubiquitous, the inevitable Monsieur Paul. He was looking at me gravely and intently. At me, or rather at my pink dress, sardonic comment on which gleamed in his eye. Now, it was his habit to indulge in strictures on the dress, both of the teachers and pupils, at Madame Beck's, a habit which the former at least held to be an offensive impertinence. As yet I had not suffered from it, my sombre daily attire not being calculated to attract notice. I was in no mood to permit any new encroachment to-night. Rather than accept his banter, I would ignore his presence, and accordingly steadily turned my face to the sleeve of Dr. John's coat, finding in that same black sleeve a prospect more redolent of pleasure and comfort, more genial, more friendly, I thought, than was offered by the dark little Professor's unlovely visage. Dr. John seemed unconsciously to sanction the preference by looking down and saying in his kind voice, "Ay, keep close to my side, Lucy. These crowding burghers are no respecters of persons." I could not, however, be true to myself. Yielding to some influence, mesmeric or otherwise, an influence unwelcome, displeasing, but effective, I again glanced round to see if M. Paul was gone. No, there he stood on the same spot, looking still, but with a changed eye. He had penetrated my thought, and read my wish to shun him. The mocking but not ill-humoured gaze was turned to a swarthy frown, and when I bowed with a view to conciliation, I got only the stiffest and sternest of nods in return. "Whom have you made angry, Lucy?" whispered Dr. Bretton, smiling. "Who is that savage-looking friend of yours?" "One of the professors at Madame Beck's, a very cross little man." "He looks mighty cross just now. What have you done to him? What is it all about? Ah, Lucy, Lucy, tell me the meaning of this." "No mystery, I assure you. Monsieur Emanuel is very exigent, and because I looked at your coat sleeve, instead of curtsying and dipping to him, he thinks I have failed in respect." "The little—" began Dr. John. I know not what more he would have added, for at that moment I was nearly thrown down amongst the feet of the crowd. M. Paul had rudely pushed past, and was elbowing his way with such utter disregard to the convenience and security of all around, that a very uncomfortable pressure was the consequence. "I think he is what he himself would call méchant," said Dr. Bretton. I thought so too. Slowly and with difficulty we made our way along the passage, and at last regained our seats. The drawing of the lottery lasted nearly an hour. It was an animating and amusing scene, and as we each held tickets, we shared in the alternations of hope and fear raised by each turn of the wheel. 2 little girls of 5 and 6 years old drew the numbers, and the prizes were duly proclaimed from the platform. These prizes were numerous, though of small value. It so fell out that Dr. John and I each gained one. Mine was a cigar case, his a lady's headdress, a most airy sort of blue and silver turban, with a streamer of plumage on one side, like a snowy cloud. He was excessively anxious to make an exchange, but I could not be brought to hear reason, and to this day I keep my cigar case. It serves, when I look at it, to remind me of old times and one happy evening. Dr. John, for his part, held his turban at arm's length between his finger and thumb, and looked at it with a mixture of reverence and embarrassment highly provocative of laughter. The contemplation over, he was about coolly to deposit the delicate fabric on the ground between his feet. He seemed to have no shadow of an idea of the treatment or stowage it ought to receive. If his mother had not come to the rescue, I think he finally would have crushed it under his arm like an opera hat. She restored it to the bandbox whence it had issued. Graham was quite cheerful all the evening, and his cheerfulness seemed natural and unforced. His demeanour, his look, is not easily described. There was something in it peculiar, and, in its way, original. I read in it no common mastery of the passions, and a fund of deep and healthy strength which, without any exhausting effort, bore down disappointment and extracted her fang. His manner now reminded me of qualities I had noticed in him when professionally engaged amongst the poor, the guilty, and the suffering in the Basse Ville. He looked at once determined, enduring, and sweet-tempered. Who could help liking him? He betrayed no weakness which harassed all your feelings with considerations as to how its faltering must be propped. From him broke no irritability which startled calm and quenched mirth. His lips let fall no caustic that burned to the bone. His eye shot no morose shafts that went cold and rusty and venomed through your heart. Beside him was rest and refuge, around him fostering sunshine. And yet he had neither forgiven nor forgotten Miss Fanshawe. Once angered, I doubt if Dr. Bretton were soon to be propitiated. Once alienated, whether he were ever to be reclaimed. He looked at her more than once, not stealthily or humbly, but with a movement of hearty, open observation. De Hamal was now a fixture beside her. Mrs. Cholmondeley sat near, and they and she were wholly absorbed in the discourse, mirth, and excitement with which the crimson seats were as much astir as any plebeian part of the hall. In the course of some apparently animated discussion, Ginevra once or twice lifted her hand and arm. A handsome bracelet gleamed upon the latter. I saw that its gleam flickered in Dr. John's eye, quickening therein a derisive, ireful sparkle. He laughed. "I think," he said, "I will lay my turban on my wonted altar of offerings. There, at any rate, it would be certain to find favour. No grisette has a more facile faculty of acceptance. Strange, for after all, I know she is a girl of family." "But you don't know her education, Dr. John," said I. "Tossed about all her life, from one foreign school to another, she may justly proffer the plea of ignorance in extenuation of most of her faults. And then, from what she says, I believe her father and mother were brought up much as she has been brought up." "I always understood she had no fortune, and once I had pleasure in the thought," said he. "She tells me," I answered, "that they are poor at home. She always speaks quite candidly on such points. You never find her lying, as these foreigners will often lie. Her parents have had a large family. They occupy such a station and possess such connections as, in their opinion, demand display. Stringent necessity of circumstances and inherent thoughtlessness of disposition combined have engendered reckless unscrupulousness as to how they obtain the means of sustaining a good appearance. This is the state of things, and the only state of things, she has seen from childhood upwards. I believe it, and I thought to mould her to something better. But, Lucy, to speak the plain truth, I have felt a new thing to-night, in looking at her and de Hamal. I felt it before noticing the impertinence directed at my mother. I saw a look interchanged between them immediately after their entrance, which threw a most unwelcome light on my mind." "How do you mean? You have been long aware of the flirtation they keep up?" "Ay, flirtation! That might be an innocent girlish wile to lure on the true lover, but what I refer to was not flirtation. It was a look marking mutual and secret understanding. It was neither girlish nor innocent. No woman, were she as beautiful as Aphrodite, who could give or receive such a glance, shall ever be sought in marriage by me. I would rather wed a paysanne in a short petticoat and high cap, and be sure that she was honest." I could not help smiling. I felt sure he now exaggerated the case. Ginevra, I was certain, was honest enough, with all her giddiness. I told him so. He shook his head, and said he would not be the man to trust her with his honour. "The only thing," said I, "with which you may safely trust her. She would unscrupulously damage a husband's purse and property, recklessly try his patience and temper. I don't think she would breathe, or let another breathe, on his honour." "You are becoming her advocate," said he. "Do you wish me to resume my old chains?" "No, I am glad to see you free, and trust that free you will long remain. Yet be at the same time just." "I am so, just as Rhadamanthus, Lucy. When once I am thoroughly estranged, I cannot help being severe. But look, the King and Queen are rising. I like that Queen. She has a sweet countenance. Mamma, too, is excessively tired. We shall never get the old lady home if we stay longer." "I tired, John?" cried Mrs. Bretton, looking at least as animated and wide awake as her son. I would undertake to sit you out yet. Leave us both here till morning, and we should see which would look the most jaded by sunrise. I should not like to try the experiment, for in truth, mamma, you are the most unfading of evergreens and the freshest of matrons. It must then be on the plea of your son's delicate nerves and fragile constitution that I found a petition for a speedy adjournment. Indolent young man, you wish you were in bed, no doubt, and I suppose you must be humoured. There is Lucy, too, looking quite done up. For shame, Lucy, at your age, a week of evenings out would not have made me a shade paler. Come away, both of you, and you may laugh at the old lady as much as you please, but for my part I shall take charge of the bandbox and turban." Which she did accordingly. I offered to relieve her, but was shaken off with kindly contempt. My godmother opined that I had enough to do to take care of myself. Not standing on ceremony now, in the midst of the gay confusion worse confounded succeeding to the King and Queen's departure, Mrs. Bretton preceded us, and promptly made us a lane through the crowd. Graham followed, apostrophizing his mother as the most flourishing grisette that had ever been his good fortune to see charged with carriage of a bandbox. He also desired me to mark her affection for the sky-blue turban, and announced his conviction that she intended one day to wear it. The night was now very cold and very dark, but with little delay we found the carriage. Soon we were packed in it, as warm and as snug as at a fireside, and the drive home was, I think, still pleasanter than the drive to the concert. Pleasant it was, even though the coachman, having spent in the shop of a marchand de vin a portion of the time we passed at the concert, drove us along the dark and solitary chaussée far past the turn leading down to La Terrasse. We, who were occupied in talking and laughing, not noticing the aberration till at last Mrs. Bretton intimated that, though she had always thought the château a retired spot, she did not know it was situated at the world's end; and as she declared seemed now to be the case, for she believed we had been an hour and a half en route, and had not yet taken the turn down the avenue. Then Graham looked out, and perceiving only dim spread fields, with unfamiliar rows of pollards and limes ranged along their else invisible sunk fences, began to conjecture how matters were, and calling a halt and descending, he mounted the box and took the reins himself. Thanks to him, we arrived safe at home about an hour and a half beyond our time. Martha had not forgotten us. A cheerful fire was burning, and a neat supper spread in the dining-room. We were glad of both. The winter dawn was actually breaking before we gained our chambers. I took off my pink dress and lace mantle with happier feelings than I had experienced in putting them on. Not all, perhaps, who had shone brightly arrayed at that concert could say the same, for not all had been satisfied with friendship, with its calm comfort and modest hope. End of chapter 20.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Catherine Chankit, Port of Spain, Trinidad and Tobago. Villette by Charlotte Brontë. Chapter 21. Reaction. Yet 3 days, and then I must go back to the pensionnat. I almost numbered the moments of these days upon the clock. Fain would I have retarded their flight, but they glided by while I watched them. They were already gone, while I yet feared their departure. "Lucy will not leave us to-day," said Mrs. Bretton coaxingly at breakfast. "She knows we can procure a second respite." "I would not ask for one if I might have it for a word," said I. "I long to get the goodbye over, and to be settled in the Rue Fossette again. I must go this morning. I must go directly. My trunk is packed and corded." It appeared, however, that my going depended upon Graham. He had said he would accompany me, and it so fell out that he was engaged all day and only returned home at dusk. Then ensued a little combat of words. Mrs. Bretton and her son pressed me to remain one night more. I could have cried, so irritated and eager was I to be gone. I longed to leave them as the criminal on the scaffold longs for the axe to descend. That is, I wished the pang over. How much I wished it, they could not tell. On these points, mine was a state of mind out of their experience. It was dark when Dr. John handed me from the carriage at Madame Beck's door. The lamp above was lit. It rained a November drizzle, as it had rained all day. The lamplight gleamed on the wet pavement. Just such a night was it as that on which, not a year ago, I had first stopped at this very threshold. Just similar was the scene. I remembered the very shapes of the paving stones which I had noted with idle eye, while, with a thick beating heart, I waited the unclosing of that door at which I stood, a solitary and a suppliant. On that night, too, I had briefly met him who now stood with me. Had I ever reminded him of that rencontre or explained it? I had not, nor ever felt the inclination to do so. It was a pleasant thought, laid by in my own mind, and best kept there. Graham rang the bell. The door was instantly opened, for it was just that period of the evening when the half-boarders took their departure. Consequently, Rosine was on the alert. "Don't come in," said I to him, but he stepped a moment into the well-lighted vestibule. I had not wished him to see that the water stood in my eyes, for his was too kind of a nature ever to be needlessly shown such signs of sorrow. He always wished to heal, to relieve, when, physician as he was, neither cure nor alleviation were, perhaps, in his power. "Keep up your courage, Lucy. Think of my mother and myself as true friends. We will not forget you." "Nor will I forget you, Dr. John." My trunk was now brought in. We had shaken hands, he had turned to go, but he was not satisfied. He had not done or said enough to content his generous impulses. "Lucy," stepping after me, "shall you feel very solitary here?" "At first I shall." "Well, my mother will soon call to see you, and meantime, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll write, just any cheerful nonsense that comes into my head. Shall I?" Good gallant heart, thought I to myself, but I shook my head, smiling, and said, "Never think of it. Impose on yourself no such task. You write to me? You'll not have time." "Oh, I will find or make time. Good-bye." He was gone. The heavy door crashed to, the axe had fallen, the pang was experienced. Allowing myself no time to think or feel, swallowing tears as if they had been wine, I passed to Madame's sitting-room to pay the necessary visit of ceremony and respect. She received me with a perfectly well-acted cordiality. She was even demonstrative, though brief, in her welcome. In 10 minutes I was dismissed. From the salle à manger I proceeded to the refectory, where pupils and teachers were now assembled for evening study. Again I had a welcome, and one not, I think, quite hollow. That over, I was free to repair to the dormitory. "And will Graham really write?" I questioned as I sank tired on the edge of the bed. Reason, coming stealthily up to me through the twilight of that long, dim chamber, whispered sedately, "He may write once. So kind is his nature, it may stimulate him for once to make the effort. But it cannot be continued, it may not be repeated. Great were that folly which should bind on such a promise, insane that credulity which should mistake the transitory rainpool holding in its hollow one draught for the perennial spring yielding the supply of seasons." I bent my head. I sat thinking an hour longer. Reason still whispered me, laying on my shoulder a withered hand and frostily touching my ear with the chill blue lips of cold. "If," muttered she, "if he should write, what then? Do you meditate pleasure in replying? Ah, fool, I warn you! Brief be your answer. Hope no delight of heart, no indulgence of intellect, grant no expansion to feeling, give holiday to no single faculty, dally with no friendly exchange, foster no genial intercommunion." "But I have talked to Graham, and you did not chide," I pleaded. "No," said she, "I needed not. Talk for you is good discipline. You converse imperfectly. While you speak, there can be no oblivion of inferiority, no encouragement to delusion. Pain, privation, penury stamp your language." "But," I again broke in, "where the bodily presence is weak and the speech contemptible, surely there cannot be error in making written language the medium of better utterance than faltering lips can achieve?" Reason only answered, "At your peril you cherish that idea, or suffer its influence to animate any writing of yours." "But if I feel, may I never express?" "Never!" declared Reason. I groaned under her bitter sternness. Never, never, oh, hard word! This hag, this reason, would not let me look up, or smile, or hope. She could not rest unless I were altogether crushed, cowed, broken in, and broken down. According to her, I was born only to work for a piece of bread, to await the pains of death, and steadily through all life to despond. Reason may be right, yet no wonder we are glad at times to defy her, to rush from under her rod and give a truant hour to imagination, her soft bright foe, our sweet help, our divine hope. We shall and must break bounds at intervals, despite the terrible revenge that awaits our return. Reason is vindictive as a devil. For me she was always envenomed as a stepmother. If I have obeyed her, it has chiefly been with the obedience of fear, not of love. Long ago I should have died of her ill usage, her stint, her chill, her barren road, her icy bed, her savage ceaseless blows, but for that kinder power who holds my secret and sworn allegiance. Often has reason turned me out by night at midwinter on cold snow, flinging for sustenance the gnawed bone dogs had forsaken. Sternly has she vowed her stores held nothing more for me, harshly denied my right to ask better things. Then, looking up, have I seen in the sky a head amid circling stars, of which the midmost and brightest lent a ray sympathetic and attent. A spirit, softer and better than human reason, has descended with quiet flight to the waste, bringing all around her a sphere of air borrowed of eternal summer, bringing perfume of flowers which cannot fade, fragrance of trees whose fruit is life, bringing breezes pure from a world whose day needs no sun to lighten it. My hunger has this good angel appeased with food, sweet and strange, gathered amongst gleaning angels, garnering their dew-white harvest in the first fresh hour of a heavenly day. Tenderly has she assuaged the insufferable fears which weep away life itself, kindly given rest to deadly weariness, generously lent hope and impulse to paralyze despair. Divine, compassionate, secureable influence! When I bend the knee to other than God, it shall be at thy white and winged feet, beautiful on mountain or on plain. Temples have been reared to the sun, altars dedicated to the moon. O greater glory! To thee neither hands build, no lips consecrate, but hearts through ages are faithful to thy worship. A dwelling thou hast, too wide for walls, too high for dome, a temple whose floors are space, rites whose mysteries transpire in presence, to the kindling, the harmony of worlds. Sovereign complete, thou hadst for endurance my great army of martyrs, for achievement thy chosen band of worthies. Deity unquestioned, thine essence foils decay. This daughter of heaven remembered me tonight. She saw me weep, and she came with comfort. Sleep, she said, sleep sweetly, I gild thy dreams. She kept her word, and watched me through a night's rest, but at dawn reason relieved the guard. I awoke with a sort of a start. The rain was dashing against the panes, and the wind uttering a peevish cry at intervals. The night lamp was dying on the black circular stand in the middle of the dormitory. Day had already broken. How I pity those whom mental pain stuns instead of rousing! This morning the pang of waking snatched me out of bed like a hand with a giant's gripe. How quickly I dressed in the cold of the raw dawn! How deeply I drank of the ice-cold water in my carafe! This was always my cordial, to which, like other dram-drinkers, I had eager recourse when unsettled by chagrin. Ere long the bell rang its réveillé to the whole school. Being dressed, I descended alone to the refectory, where the stove was lit and the air was warm. Through the rest of the house it was cold, with the nipping severity of the continental winter, though now but the beginning of November, a north wind had thus early brought a wintry blight over Europe. I remember the black stoves pleased me little when I first came, but now I began to associate with them a sense of comfort, and liked them, as in England we like a fireside. Sitting down before this dark comforter, I presently fell into a deep argument with myself on life and its chances, on destiny and her decrees. My mind, calmer and stronger now than last night, made for itself some imperious rules, prohibiting under deadly penalties all weak retrospect of happiness past, commanding a patient journeying through the wilderness of the present, enjoining a reliance on faith, a watching of the cloud and pillar which subdue while they guide, and awe while they illuminate, hushing the impulse to fond idolatry, checking the longing outlook for a far-off promised land whose rivers are, perhaps, never to be reached save in dying dreams. Those sweet pastures are to be viewed from the desolate and sepulchral summit of a Nebo. By degrees, a composite feeling of blended strength and pain wound itself wirily round my heart, sustained, or at least restrained, its throbbings, and made me fit for the day's work. I lifted my head. As I said before, I was sitting near the stove, let into the wall beneath the refectory and the carré, thus sufficing to heat both apartments. Piercing the same wall, and close beside the stove, was a window, looking also into the carré. As I looked up, a cap tassel, a brow, 2 eyes, filled a pane of that window. The fixed gaze of those 2 eyes hit right against my own glance. They were watching me. I had not till that moment known that tears were on my cheek, but I felt them now. This was a strange house, where no corner was sacred from intrusion, where not a tear could be shed, nor a thought pondered, but a spy was at hand to note and to divine. And this outdoor, this male spy, what business had brought him to the premises at this unwonted hour? What possible right had he to intrude on me thus? No other professor would have dared to cross the carré before the class bell rang. Monsieur Emmanuel took no account of hours nor of claims. There was some book of reference in the first-class library which he had occasion to consult. He had come to seek it. On his way he passed the refectory. It was very much his habit to wear eyes before, behind, and on each side of him. He had seen me through the little window. He now opened the refectory door, and there he stood. Mademoiselle, vous êtes triste. Monsieur, j'en ai bien le droit. Vous êtes malade de cœur et d'humeur, he bruised. You are at once mournful and mutinous. I see on your cheek 2 tears which I know are hot as 2 sparks and salt as 2 crystals of the sea. While I speak, you eye me strangely. Shall I tell you of what I am reminded while watching you? Monsieur, I shall be called away to prayers shortly. My time for conversation is very scant and brief at this hour. I excuse everything, he interrupted. My mood is so meek, neither rebuff nor, perhaps, insult could ruffle it. You remind me, then, of a young she-wild creature, new-caught, untamed, viewing with a mixture of fire and fear the first entrance of the breaker in. Unwarrantable accost! Rash and crude if addressed to a pupil, to a teacher inadmissible! He thought to provoke a warm reply. I had seen him vex the passionate to explosion before now. In me his malice should find no gratification. I sat silent. You look, said he, like one who would snatch a draught of sweet poison and spurn wholesome bitters with disgust. Indeed, I never liked bitters, nor do I believe them wholesome. And to whatever is sweet, be it poison or food, you cannot at least deny its own delicious quality, sweetness. Better, perhaps, to die quickly a pleasant death than to drag on a long, charmless life. Yet, said he, you should take your bitter dose dully and daily, if I had the power to administer it. And, as to the well-beloved poison, I would, perhaps, break the very cup which held it. I sharply turned my head away, partly because his presence utterly displeased me, and partly because I wished to shun questions, lest, in my present mood, the effort of answering should overmaster self-command. Come, said he more softly, tell me the truth. You grieve at being parted from friends, is it not so? The insinuating softness was not more acceptable than the inquisitorial curiosity. I was silent. He came into the room, sat down on the bench about 2 yards from me, and persevered long, and for him patiently, in attempts to draw me into conversation, attempts necessarily unavailing, because I could not talk. At last I entreated to be left alone. In uttering the request, my voice faltered, my head sank on my arms and the table. I wept bitterly, though quietly. He sat a while longer. I did not look up nor speak till the closing door and his retreating step told me that he was gone. These tears proved a relief. I had time to bathe my eyes before breakfast, and I suppose I appeared at that meal as serene as any other person, not, however, quite as jocund-looking as the young lady who placed herself in the seat opposite mine, fixed on me a pair of somewhat small eyes twinkling gleefully, and frankly stretched across the table a white hand to be shaken. Miss Fanshawe's travels, gaieties, and flirtations agreed with her mightily. She had become quite plump, her cheeks looked as round as apples. I had seen her last in elegant evening attire. I don't know that she looked less charming now in her school dress, a kind of careless peignoir of a dark blue material, dimly and dingily plaited with black. I even think this dusky wrapper gave her charms a triumph, enhancing by contrast the fairness of her skin, the freshness of her bloom, the golden beauty of her tresses. "I am glad you are come back, Timon," said she. Timon was one of her dozen names for me. "You don't know how often I have wanted you in this dismal hole." "Oh, have you? Then, of course, if you wanted me, you have something for me to do, stockings to mend, perhaps." I never gave Ginevra a minute's or a farthing's credit for disinterestedness. "Crabbed and crusty as ever," said she. "I expected as much. It would not be you if you did not snub me. But now, come, grandmother, I hope you like coffee as much, and pistolets as little as ever. Are you disposed to barter?" "Take your own way." This way consisted in a habit she had of making me convenient. She did not like the morning cup of coffee, its school brewage not being strong or sweet enough to suit her palate, and she had an excellent appetite, like any other healthy schoolgirl, for the morning pistolet or rolls, which were new-baked and very good, and of which a certain allowance was served to each. This allowance being more than I needed, I gave half to Ginevra, never varying in my preference, though many others used to covet the superfluity, and she in return would sometimes give me a portion of her coffee. This morning I was glad of the draught. Hunger I had none, and with thirst I was parched. I don't know why I chose to give my bread rather to Ginevra than to another, nor why, if two had to share the convenience of one drinking vessel, as sometimes happened, for instance, when we took a long walk into the country, and halted for refreshment at a farm, I always contrived that she should be my convive, and rather liked to let her take the lion's share, whether of the white bear, the sweet wine, or the new milk. So it was, however, and she knew it, and therefore, while we wrangled daily, we were never alienated. After breakfast, my custom was to withdraw to the first class, and sit and read, or think, oftenest the latter, there alone, till the 9 o'clock bell threw open all doors, admitted the gathered rush of externes and demi-pensionnaires, and gave the signal for entrance on that bustle and business to which, till 5 p.m., there was no relax. I was just seated this morning, when a tap came to the door. "Pardon, mademoiselle," said a pensionnaire, entering gently, and having taken from her desk some necessary book or paper, she withdrew on tiptoe, murmuring as she passed me, "Que mademoiselle est appliquée!" Appliquée, indeed! The means of application were spread before me, but I was doing nothing, and had done nothing, and meant to do nothing. Thus does the world give us credit for merits we have not. Madame Beck herself deemed me a regular bas bleu, and often and solemnly used to warn me not to study too much, lest the blood should all go to my head. Indeed, everybody in the Rue Fossette had a superstition that Miss Lucie was learned, with the notable exception of Monsieur Emmanuel, who, by means peculiar to himself and quite inscrutable to me, had obtained a not inaccurate inkling of my real qualifications, and used to take quiet opportunities of chuckling in my ear his malign glee over their scant measure. For my part, I never troubled myself about this penury. I dearly liked to think my own thoughts, and had great pleasure in reading a few books, but not many, preferring always those on whose style or sentiment the writer's individual nature was plainly stamped, flagging inevitably over characterless books, however clever and meritorious, perceiving well that, as far as my own mind was concerned, God had limited its powers, and in its action, thankful, I trust, for the gift bestowed, but unambitious of higher endowments, not restlessly eager after higher culture. The polite pupil was scarcely gone, when, unceremoniously, without tap, in burst a second intruder. Had I been blind, I should have known who this was. A constitutional reserve of manner had by this time told with wholesome and, for me, commodious effect on the manners of my co-inmates. Rarely did I now suffer from rude or intrusive treatment. When I first came, it would happen once and again that a blunt German would clap me on the shoulder and ask me to run a race, or a riotous Labascourienne seize me by the arm and drag me towards the playground. Urgent proposals to take a swing at the pas de géant, or to join in a certain romping hide-and-seek game called 1, 2, 3, were formerly also an hourly occurrence, but all these little attentions had ceased some time ago, ceased, too, without my finding it necessary to be at the trouble of point-blank cutting them short. I had now no familiar demonstration to dread or endure, save from one quarter, and as that was English, I could bear it. Ginevra Fanshawe made no scruple of, at times, catching me as I was crossing the carré, whirling me around in a compulsory waltz, and heartily enjoying the mental and physical discomfiture her proceeding induced. Ginevra Fanshawe it was who now broke upon in my learned leisure. She carried a huge music-book under her arm. "Go to your practising," I said to her at once. "Away with you to the little salon." "Not till I've had a talk with you, cher ami. I know where you have been spending your vacation, and how you have commenced sacrificing to the graces and enjoying life like any other belle. I saw you at the concert the other night, dressed actually like anybody else. Who is your tailleuse?" "Tittle-tattle, how prettily it begins. My tailleuse. A fiddlestick. Come, sheer off, Ginevra. I really don't want your company." "But when I want yours so much, ange farouche, what does a little reluctance on your part signify? Dieu merci! We know how to manoeuvre with our gifted compatriot, the learned ours britannique. And so, Ourson, do you know Isidore?" "I know John Bretton." "Oh, hush!" putting her fingers in her ears. "You crack my tympanums with your rude anglicisms. But how is our well-beloved John? Do tell me about him. The poor man must be in a sad way. What did he say to my behaviour the other night? Wasn't I cruel?" "Do you think I noticed you?" "It was a delightful evening. Oh, that divine de Hamal! And then to watch the others skulking and dying in the distance, and the old lady, my future mamma-in-law. But I am afraid that I and Lady Sarah were a little rude in quizzing her." "Lady Sarah never quizzed her at all. And for what you did, don't make yourself in the least uneasy. Mrs. Bretton will survive your sneer." "She may. Old ladies are tough. But that poor son of hers! Do tell me what he said. I saw he was terribly cut up." "He said you looked as if at heart you were already Madame de Hamal." "Did he?" she cried with delight. "He noticed that? How charming! I thought he would have been mad with jealousy." "Ginevra, have you seriously done with Dr. Bretton? Do you want him to give you up?" "Ah, you know he can't do that. But wasn't he mad?" "Quite mad," I assented, "as mad as a March hare." "Well, and how ever did you get him home?" "How ever, indeed! Have you no pity on his poor mother and me? Fancy us holding him tight down in the carriage, and he raving between us fit to drive everybody delirious. The very coachman went wrong, somehow, and we lost our way." "You don't say so! You are laughing at me. Now, Lucy Snowe, I assure you it is a fact, and fact also that Dr. Bretton would not stay in the carriage. He broke from us, and would ride outside." "And afterwards?" Afterwards, when he did reach home, the scene transcends description. "Ah, but describe it. You know it is such fun." "Fun for you, Miss Fanshawe. But," with stern gravity, "you know the proverb, 'What is sport to one may be death to another.'" "Go on, there's a darling Timo." "Conscientiously I cannot, unless you assure me you have some heart." "I have such an immensity you don't know." "Good. In that case, you will be able to conceive that Dr. Graham Bretton rejecting his supper in the first instance, the chicken, the sweetbread prepared for his refreshment left on the table untouched. Then, but it is of no use dwelling at length on the harrowing details. Suffice it to say that never, in the most stormy fits and moments of his infancy, had his mother such work to stuck the sheets about him as she had that night. He wouldn't lie still? He wouldn't lie still. There it was. The sheets might be tucked in, but the thing was to keep them tucked in. And what did he say? Say? Can't you imagine him demanding his divine Ginevra, anathematizing that demon de Hamal, raving about golden locks, blue eyes, white arms, glittering bracelets? No, did he? He saw the bracelet? Saw the bracelet? Yes, as plain as I saw it, and, perhaps for the first time, he saw also the brand mark with which its pressure had encircled your arm. Ginevra, raising and changing my tone, come, we will have an end of this. Go away to your practising. And I opened the door. But you have not told me all. You had better not wait till I do tell you all. Such extra communicativeness would give you no pleasure. March! Cross thing, said she, but she obeyed. And, indeed, the first class was my territory, and she could not there legally resist a notice of quittance from me. Yet, to speak the truth, never had I been less dissatisfied with her than I was then. There was pleasure in thinking of the contrast between the reality and my description, to remember Dr. John enjoying the drive home, eating his supper with relish, and retiring to rest with Christian composure. It was really only when I saw him really unhappy that I felt really vexed with the fair, frail cause of his suffering. A fortnight passed. I was getting once more inured to the harshness of school, and lapsing from the passionate pain of change to the palsy of custom. One afternoon, in crossing the carré, on my way to the first class, where I was expected to assist at a lesson of style and literature, I saw, standing by one of the long and large windows, Rosine, the portress. Her attitude, as usual, was quite nonchalant. She always stood at ease. One of her hands rested on her apron pocket, the other at this moment held to her eyes a letter, whereof Mademoiselle coolly perused the address and deliberately studied the seal. A letter! The shape of a letter similar to that had haunted my brain in its very core for 7 days past. I had dreamed of a letter last night. Strong magnetism drew me to that letter now, yet, whether I should have ventured to demand of Rosine so much as a glance at that white envelope, with the spot of red wax in the middle, I know not. No, I think I should have sneaked past in terror or a rebuff from disappointment. My heart throbbed now as if I had already heard the tramp of her approach. Nervous mistake. It was the rapid step of the professor of literature measuring the corridor. I fled before him. Could I but be seated quietly at my desk before his arrival, with the class under my orders, all in disciplined readiness, he would perhaps exempt me from notice, but if caught lingering in the carré, I should be sure to come in for a special harangue. I had time to get seated, to enforce perfect silence, to take up my work, and to commence it amidst the profoundest and best trained hush, ere Monsieur Emmanuel entered with his vehement burst of latch and panel, his deep redundant bow, prophetic of choler. As usual, he broke upon us like a clap of thunder, but instead of flashing lightning-wise from the door to the estrade, his career halted midway at my desk. Setting his face towards me and the window, his back to the pupils and the room, he gave me a look, such a look as might have licensed me to stand straight up and demand what he meant, a look of scowling distrust. "Voilà pour vous," said he, drawing his hand from his waistcoat and placing on my desk a letter, the very letter I had seen in Rosine's hand, the letter whose face of enamelled white and single cyclops eye of vermilion red had printed themselves so clear and perfect on the retina of an inward vision. I knew it. I felt it to be the letter of my hope, the fruition of my wish, the release from my doubt, the ransom for my terror. This letter Monsieur Paul, with his unwarrantably interfering habits, had taken from the portress, and now delivered it himself. I might have been angry, but had not a second for the sensation. Yes, I held in my hand not a slight note, but an envelope, which must at least contain a sheet. It felt not flimsy, but firm, substantial, satisfying. And here was the direction: Miss Lucy Snowe, in a clean, clear, equal, decided hand. And here was the seal, round, full, deftly dropped by untremulous fingers, stamped with the well-cut impress of initials, J.G.B. I experienced a happy feeling, a glad emotion which went from warm to my heart and ran lively through all my veins. For once a hope was realized. I held in my hand a morsel of real solid joy, not a dream, not an image of the brain, not one of those shadowy chances imagination pictures, and on which humanity starves but cannot live, not a mess of that manna I drearily eulogized a while ago, which, indeed, at first melts on the lips with an unspeakable and preternatural sweetness, but which, in the end, our souls full surely loathe, longing deliriously for natural and earth-grown food, widely praying heaven's spirits to reclaim their own spirit-dew and essence, an aliment divine, but for mortals deadly. It was neither sweet hail nor small coriander seed, neither slight wafer nor luscious honey I had lighted on. It was the wild, savoury mess of the hunter, nourishing yet salubrious meat, forest-fed or desert-reared, fresh, healthful, and life-sustaining. It was what the old dying patriarch demanded of his son Esau, promising in requital the blessing of his last breath. It was a godsend, and I inwardly thanked the God who had vouchsafed it. Outwardly I only thanked man, crying, thank you, monsieur." Monsieur curled his lip, gave me a vicious glance of the eye, and strode to his estrade. Monsieur Paul was not at all a good little man, though he had good points. Did I read my letter there and then? Did I consume the venison at once and with haste, as if Esau's shaft flew every day? I knew better. The cover, with its address, the seal, with its 3 clear letters, was bounty and abundance for the present. I stole from the room. I produced the key of the great dormitory, which was kept locked by day. I went to my bureau, with a sort of haste and trembling, lest Madame should creep upstairs and spy me. I opened the drawer, unlocked a box, and took out a case, and, having feasted my eyes with one more look, and approached the seal with a mixture of awe and shame and delight, to my lips, I folded the untasted treasure, yet all fair and inviolate, in silver paper, committed it to the case, shut up the box and drawer, reclosed, relocked the dormitory, and returned to class, feeling as if fairy tales were true, and fairy gifts no dream. Strange, sweet insanity! And this letter, the source of my joy, I had not yet read, did not yet know the number of its lines. When I re-entered the schoolroom, behold Monsieur Paul raging like a pestilence. Some pupil had not spoken audibly or distinctly enough to suit his air and taste, and now she and others were weeping, and he was raving from his estrade almost livid. Curious to mention, as I appeared, he fell on me. Was I the mistress of these girls? Did I profess to teach them the conduct befitting ladies? And did I permit, and, he doubted not, encourage them to strangle their mother tongue in their throats, to mince and mash it between their teeth, as if they had some base cause to be ashamed of the words they uttered? Was this modesty? He knew better, It was a vile pseudo-sentiment, the offspring of the forerunner of evil. Rather than submit to this mopping and mowing, his mincing and grimacing, this grinding of a noble tongue, this general affectation and sickening stubbornness of the pupils of the first class, he would throw them up for a set of insupportable petites maîtresses, and confined himself to teaching the ABC to babies of the third division. What could I say to all this? Really nothing, and I hoped he would allow me to be silent. The storm recommenced. Every answer to his queries was then refused. It seemed to be considered in that place, that conceited boudoir of a first class, with its pretentious bookcases, its green baize desk, its rubbish of flower-stands, its trash of framed pictures and maps, and its foreign surveillante, forsooth, it seemed to be the fashion to think there that the professor of literature was not worthy a reply. These were new ideas, imported, he did not doubt, straight from La Grande Bretagne. They savoured of island insolence and arrogance. Lull the second, the girls, not one of them who was ever known to weep a tear for the rebukes of any other master, now all melting like snow, statues before the intemperate heat of Monsieur Emmanuel, I not yet much shaken, sitting down, and venturing to resume my work. Something, either in my continued silence or in the movement of my hand stitching, transported Monsieur Emmanuel beyond the last boundary of patience. He actually sprang from his estrade. His stove stood near my desk. He attacked it. The little iron door was nearly dashed from its hinges. The fuel was made to fly. "Est-ce que vous avez l'intention de m'insulter?" he said to me in a low, furious voice, as he thus outraged under pretence of arranging the fire. It was time to soothe him a little, if possible. "Mais, monsieur," said I would not insult you for the world. I remember too well that you once said we should be friends." I did not intend my voice to falter, but it did, more, I think, through the agitation of late delight than any spasm of present fear. Still, there was certainly something in Monsieur Paul's anger, a kind of passion of emotion, that specially tended to draw tears. I was not unhappy, nor much afraid, yet I wept. "Allons, allons," he said presently, looking round and seeing the deluge universal. "Decidedly I am a monster and a ruffian. I have only one pocket-handkerchief," he added, "but if I had 20 I would offer you each one. Your teacher shall be your representative. Here, Miss Lucy." And he took forth and held out to me a clean silk handkerchief. Now, a person who did not know Monsieur Paul, who was unused to him and his impulses, would naturally have bungled at his offer, declined accepting the same, etc. But I too plainly felt this would never do. The slightest hesitation would have been fatal to the incipient treaty of peace. I rose and met the handkerchief halfway, received it with decorum, wiped hair with my eyes, and, resuming my seat and retraining the flag of truce in my hand and on my lap, took especial care during the remainder of the lesson to touch neither needle nor thimble, scissors nor muslin. Many a jealous glance that Monsieur Paul cast at these implements. He hated them mortally, considering sewing a source of distraction from the attention due to himself. A very eloquent lesson he gave, and very kind and friendly was he to the close. Ere he had done, the clouds were dispersed and the sun shining out. Tears were exchanged for smiles. In quitting the room, he paused once more at my desk. "And your letter?" said he, this time not quite fiercely. "I have not read it yet, monsieur." "Ah, it is too good to read at once. You save it, as, when I was a boy, I used to save a peach whose bloom was very ripe?" The guess came so near the truth, I could not prevent a suddenly rising warmth in my face from revealing as much. "You promised yourself a pleasant moment," said he, "in reading that letter. You will open it when alone, n'est-ce pas? Ah, a smile answers. Well, well, one should not be too harsh. La jeunesse n'a qu'un temps." "Monsieur, monsieur," I cried, or rather whispered after him as he turned to go, "do not leave me under a mistake. This is merely a friend's letter. Without reading it, I can vouch for that. Je conçois, on sait que c'est qu'un ami. Bonjour, mademoiselle. But, monsieur, here is your handkerchief. Keep it till the letter is read, then bring it to me. I shall read the billet's tenor in your eyes. When he was gone, the pupils having already poured out of the schoolroom into the berceau, and thence into the garden and court to take their customary recreation before the 5 o'clock dinner, I stood a moment thinking, and absently twisting the handkerchief round my arm. For some reason, gladdened, I think, by a sudden return of the golden glimmer of childhood, roused by an unwonted renewal of its buoyancy, made merry by the liberty of the closing hour, and, above all, solaced at the heart by the joyous consciousness of that treasure in the case, box, drawer, upstairs, I fell to playing with the handkerchief as if it were a ball, casting it into the air and catching it as it fell. The game was stopped by another hand than mine, a hand emerging from a patelot sleeve and stretched over my shoulder. It caught the extemporized plaything and bore it away with these sullen words: Je vois bien que vous vous moquez de moi et de mes effets. Really, that little man was dreadful, a mere sprite of caprice and ubiquity, one never knew either his whim or his whereabout. End of chapter 21.